Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video I'll be talking about another one of my all-time favorite games, Persona 5, around 5 years after its initial Japanese release. Now obviously I didn't get around to playing this when it was originally released in Japan. I didn't play it until it was released in English, and even then I didn't even play it right away. I actually waited until the end of 2017 to play it, but it's a game that I absolutely fell in love with when I did. It's just a game that I wish I had more time to play, to fully experience everything this game has to offer. But when I played this, it had been a while since I had last been invested in a turn-based RPG. And with this game mixing that with social sim elements and then adding on a narrative that is very reminiscent to shonen anime, which felt really nostalgic to me. I mean, this game was the perfect package. The problem is, again, it takes almost 100 hours to finish. And because of that, I never really took the time to play the game again after my initial playthrough. That is until, obviously, now. And I was finally able to play Persona 5 Royal, which is obviously the enhanced version of the game, with more content, new game mechanics, and now that I've played the game a bit more recently, and with the anniversary here, we might as well talk about it. Now, most of this video will be talking about the base version of the game, but at the very end, I will also talk about my thoughts on the additions made for the Royal version as well. So let's start talking about the actual game itself, which is mostly split between two radically different genres of turn-based RPG and social simulator. But this game does masterfully blend the two by having each system progress the other one. The progress that you make in the social sim elements of the game benefit the personas and the abilities that you can use during the combat of the RPG elements of the game. The entirety of the game revolves around a calendar system, with each day having a day and night cycle, with different activities that are able to be done during the day or night time. You can only do one major activity each day and night, and once you complete one of each, the game progresses a day. Obviously, some days are scripted to progress the game's narrative or to force you to spend some time in the metaverse, but for the most part, you do have the choice of what you want to do each day, though there is obviously a deadline for most of the story beats that you do have to keep in mind as well. But you can do a wide range of things, from having a part-time job or doing similar activities that are able to increase your social stats. You're able to create infiltration tools to help you inside of the palaces, or probably most notably, you can spend time with your confidants, which introduce side stories with them, leading to possible romances, but more importantly, greatly help you with creating new personas, as they give you bonus experience whenever a newly formed persona matches the confidant's arcana. But some of these also give extra perks, like the ability to use baton pass or other types of bonuses with the respective confidant, or it can give you new items to craft. Again, really cool abilities that connect the two gameplay sections. The side stories associated with the confidants are hit or miss for me. There are some that I do really enjoy, like Makoto's, An's, Haru's, Kawakami's, but there are also some like Mishima's or Chiaya's who I just never really was that interested in. I also just had fun walking around Shibuya or Akihabara or any of these other real life locations and going into stores to get items that would benefit me, increasing my social stats. Again, like renting DVDs, buying video games, and playing them. That was a really fun element of the game for me. Like, really, the social sim element of the game was the thing that initially caught my attention when playing the game. And it's a really fascinating system, as you really have to manage your time well, as again, you have a preset amount of time due to the calendar system to do the things that you want to do. You're not going to be able to do everything the game has to offer within one single playthrough. But the main portion of the game occurs within the metaverse, which is where the more traditional RPG gameplay takes over. The main story is progressed by traversing through dungeons known as palaces, and also during your free time you can go into mementos, which consists of randomly generated dungeons that you do need to get through by the end of the game, but isn't really a priority throughout most of the story. To the point where I didn't even bother with it my initial playthrough, and that really ended up backfiring on me, obviously, as you have to complete it before the end of the game. I had to do the entirety of it during one day, and that was not fun, but I did rectify that on my most current playthrough to where I was already on the bottom by the time the story needs you to be there. But Mementos is also where you complete requests, which are essentially the side quests in the game, and I find them mostly tedious, with most of them being really easy in terms of the actual battles, and narratively they aren't that interesting either. Though some of them do end up connecting to the confidant system, where certain confidants can't be increased unless you do these requests for them, and that's a cool way to, again, mix the two systems together. And while I'm on this topic, I might as well talk about the level gating with the social skills, which is also annoying as well. Again, you need to be at certain levels with certain social skills in order to progress with certain confidants. Again, I get it from a gameplay standpoint. It makes sense. It's just annoying, and it really halted my progression with a lot of the confidants to the point where it's obviously you just grinding so you can continue these sub-stories. Though, obviously, that does also incentivize you to do many of the other side activities within the game, which is also a benefit as well. Now, most of the RPG sections of the game take place in palaces, which are the main way to progress the story, and these are, again, essentially glorified dungeons, which, I used to hate dungeon crawlers when I was younger. I don't like the idea of being in this puzzle-ridden area that has a wide array of enemies to fight, but I think this game does a great job at making you forget that you're essentially in a dungeon. And when you're doing these puzzles and you find a room filled with enemies, and when you're searching for a safe room where you can save, all these things are things that I should be annoyed by, but I never really felt annoyed by that in this game. Though, come on, why are safe rooms still a thing? Like, why can't we just save at any point? But whatever, again, it wasn't that bad over the course of the game, though. Now let's talk about the combat system, which I found to be really fun. I've always known that people compared Persona to Pokemon, and Persona 5's combat system takes what you would expect from Pokemon, but expands upon it in every possible way. You can use 4 party members at a time, with each character outside of Joker focusing on a certain elemental style of attack, and with the numerous personas that you can collect throughout the game, you can really diversify the skills that you are able to use. You can get these new personas through negotiations, and they can be fused together or sacrificed in order to empower other personas. And again, the confidant system really boons this process as well, as it gives you bonuses when doing these things, and I just found it so much fun to manage my personas, to get the strongest personas I could have while also keeping the most varied set of skills that I could as well. Stealth is also an element in this game, and attacking an enemy without being seen gives you an advantage in battle, while obviously the opposite. If an enemy hits you first, they end up surrounding you and they have an advantage in battle. I thought that was a nice element to this game. You do have melee and range weapons that can be upgraded and customized in the real world, and these attacks don't waste HP or SP, so there are points where these are more useful to use, especially considering I tried to conserve my use of items throughout the palaces, so this allowed me to save up SP when I didn't need to waste it. I did also enjoy managing the party members in order to make sure that I could hit my enemy's weaknesses, as again, hitting your enemy's weaknesses doesn't just cause more damage, but it also allows you to knock an enemy down, which can lead to an extra turn. And if all enemies are knocked down, that means you can do an all-out attack, which does even more damage, or you can enter a negotiation, which obviously is the way that you gain new personas. So all of these things were really fun additions to the standard turn-based RPG gameplay that made the combat system here really, really fun. I also feel like I need to talk about this game's style, which might be the most stylish game I've ever played. The way that this game is presented, the UI, the menus, and most importantly for me, the music creates this really unforgettable style. That's probably the thing that I remember the most from this game. I do think there's an argument that this game has the best soundtrack in the history of gaming. I regularly listen to this game's soundtrack, despite not having played this game for years before this most current replay. Like, whenever I think of Persona, one of the first things I think about is its soundtrack, and that is something I think you have to give this game a lot of credit for. Now let's talk about the narrative, which, again, always remind me of a shonen anime, where after the initial creation of the Phantom Thieves, we get what are essentially these arcs that are revolved around the new members that get added to the team, and the main antagonist of the arc is usually connected to that new member. I do really love how the narrative is structured here, though I will say that it's probably longer than it needs to be, though really that sums up the entirety of the game. But the narrative starts off in medias res during the end of the Seinijima Palace, and we do have Joker getting arrested, and the majority of the story is Joker telling his story to Sei, which is a really cool way to start off this game and gives us a good chunk of mystery for how we got into these circumstances. But after a pretty lengthy prologue introducing us to Joker, the silent protagonist, who he himself doesn't have much of a character, as he really serves as a representation of the player within the world, but we do get introduced to his backstory, that he has to live in Tokyo during his 1-year probation for falsely being accused of assault. And through this, we also get introduced to his caretaker in Sojiro, who has a really nice arc over the course of the story. I really like how his relationship with Joker grew over time, though obviously at first he's kind of a dick. But the prologue does also introduce us to Shujin Academy and some of the confidants. The more notable confidants for me include Takemi, who you can buy medicinal items from, and while I didn't initially connect with her character, I do think her confidant storyline was pretty solid. We do have Kawakami, who is Joker's teacher, and this leads to this really strange storyline where she's like this part-time maid, and you have to pay to request her to come to your house, and that allows you to obviously build your confidant level with her. And the fact that you can romance her is also just really awkward, but I did enjoy that storyline as a whole. There's a Y whose storyline wasn't really one that I was super invested in, but his confidant storyline does lead to unlocking weapon upgrades, so that's a pretty important one to eventually get, though you can't actually make him a confidant very early on in the game due to, again, the social skill level gating. Hifumi was a confidant that I progressed with as well, and I always expected her to give us better abilities in combat than what she ends up doing. I mean, she is a shogi player, so the game tries to make you think that, oh, she's going to help you with strategies in the combat of the game, but it's like none of the bonuses were really that important. But moving on with the story, I mean, Joker does end up meeting up with Ryuji, and they end up accidentally landing in Kamoshida's palace, and this starts the first arc of the game. I mean, this first arc doesn't really focus on one particular character, but ends up progressing the storylines of all the characters involved. And we have Ryuji, who is a really fun character, your typical like brash best friend figure, one who is relatively shallow initially, but I think grows on you over time, especially after doing his confidant story. In the palace, we do meet up with Morgana, who is another really fun character, but one that also serves as a guide through the metaverse. I mean, he gives us a lot of needed exposition on how the metaverse works, and this leads to the discovery that by stealing a person's treasure within their palace, they can change these people's hearts. And after An gets involved, they end up working together to take down Kamoshida. And An was my favorite female character the first time I played the game, and while I do enjoy her confidant storyline, after the first two arcs, I do feel like her importance in the story significantly decreases. And I feel like she just becomes the attractive person in the group and doesn't really have much else to do. But we do end up taking down Kamoshida, which leads to them forming the Phantom Thieves, and we get this celebration of the buffet, which is the same format that will get repeated over the course of the next 4 arcs, where in each of these we would get introduced to a character that would later end up joining the group. The antagonist gets introduced that is in some way connected to the new character, and that leads to a certain deadline that they need to take down the antagonist by. We do the palace infiltration, we send a calling card, we do the final boss battle with the antagonist, wait until deadline, and on the deadline we do see the change of heart, and this leads to a celebration that leads to some fun character moments. Again, we see this cycle over and over and over again with minor changes, but this is the type of cycle that the majority of the story does utilize. Not saying that this is a bad thing, but this is just a thing that I noticed after replaying the game here. The next 3 arcs don't really do much to progress the overarching narrative outside of the Phantom Thieves getting more attention and obviously introducing more characters, but that doesn't mean that they aren't great. I mean, the next arc revolves around Madarame and Yusuke joining the group, and Yusuke is probably my least favorite Phantom Thief. I mean, while his character does a good job at being this like stoic, socially awkward figure within the group, he is really the only Phantom Thief confidant I've never finished, largely because I never felt invested in his confidant storyline, and after his initial arc here, I don't feel like he adds much to the story as a whole, but that doesn't mean I didn't love his story during this arc. I mean, him learning about his mother's death and all the wrongdoings Madarame has been up to, I mean, that stuff's fantastic, and I do think this arc perfectly suits what his character needed. It's just that beyond this, he isn't really a focal point. The third arc, it revolves around Makoto, who blackmails the Phantom Thieves into helping her take down Kaneshiro, a crime boss messing with Shujin students, and Kaneshiro for me is really forgettable, but I did really love Makoto's portrayal here. I think as time has gone on, Makoto is probably now my favorite of all the Phantom Thieves. I think her character development is really strong during this arc, and she sort of acts as a second command figure for the group. I mean, she is a really strong, confident story as well. And also her connection to Sei makes her a really important figure within the narrative moving forward. So my appreciation for her as a character has definitely increased during my replay here. The fourth arc changes things up a bit, where Medjed is this hacker group that plans on exposing the Phantom Thieves, and I always found this storyline really convoluted, especially because we end up getting a message about going into Futaba's palace, and it turns out Futaba is the one that sent that message, and we spend the entire arc trying to change Futaba's heart just so that she can help us take down Medjed, which she's able to do because she's this special hacker person. So again, like, instead of just directly taking down Medjed, we're like changing the heart of someone that can help take down Medjed. Like, it just feels really strange to me. I never really loved how this storyline progressed, but I do think this arc does a really great job at establishing Futaba's character. I think Futaba's a really likable character and with a really tragic backstory. I liked her as like a little sister sort of character for Joker, though again, I find it really weird that you can romance her. And kind of like Kawakami, I just find this romance really strange. It always felt icky to me, especially because like her portrayal obviously makes her feel really young. The 5th arc is where the main storyline starts to pick up. We do have Morgana leaving the group as he starts to feel less vital, and obviously he eventually rejoins the group, and this also leads to Haru ending up joining the group, who is the daughter of Okumura, the arc's antagonist. And this is where a lot of the foreshadowing over the last few arcs about a black masked assassin comes to head, where we see him kill Okumura after we defeat him in the final boss battle. And I mean, really, this is kind of dumb if you really think about it. It's like the fact that like the shadow version of Okumura is killed whenever you do the final boss battle, but for some reason Okumura doesn't die until the deadline for some reason. Like, again, that's really, really dumb. It makes no sense, but whatever. I mean, this does lead to the Phantom Thieves being framed for his murder, and this kickstarts the main narrative. But before moving on, let's talk about Haru, who I didn't like during my first playthrough. I mean, I think during my first playthrough, she was easily my least favorite Phantom Thief, though I do feel like on the replay here, I definitely enjoyed her a lot more, and a lot of that had to do with me being able to play her confidant storyline, which I wasn't able to do the first time, and I felt like that really developed her character, which is something that she doesn't really get any of in the main story, especially because she's introduced relatively late into it. And that leads us to the 6th arc that revolves around us trying to stop the investigation into the Phantom Thieves, so we go after Sei Nijima, and we team up with Goro Akechi, who had been in the game for the last few arcs, but here he actually joins the group, and I love Akechi as a character, though a lot of the reasons for that come up later in the narrative. But the arc ends with the escape from the palace, which we saw at the beginning of the game, and now we're caught up. But we still have a lot to go, and I did find that really strange, as with most stories that start in media res, it catches up right before the final confrontation of the narrative. But here, again, we still have so much more to go. I mean, I guess the game does try to make you think that we're right before the final confrontation, because the game does try to make you think that the Shido battle is the final battle in the game, but in reality, obviously, there's another arc's worth of game left after that. But again, like, we still have so much more to go. I mean, here we find out that Joker's arrest was always the plan, and that the Phantom Thieves always knew that Akechi was actually the assassin. They were trying to catch him the entire time. So we get this really convoluted plot that Akechi actually killed like a shadow version of Joker, and that he was in the metaverse without knowing he was. He thought it was in the real world, and he gets caught. And again, to be honest, I didn't fully understand everything that's going on here. Like, this felt way too convoluted for its own good, but it is a pretty big turning point in the overall story, where at this point we obviously find out that Shido, a politician that had appeared earlier in the game, is the mastermind behind everything, where essentially he had been using Akechi to kill his opponents so that he can become the prime minister, and he's also revealed to be the guy that framed Joker to begin with. And we have to go change his heart, so we go to his palace. And while we're there, we have our final confrontation with Akechi, which is a fantastic boss battle. Definitely one of my favorite boss battles in the game. And this section really made me fall in love with Akechi's character, where he essentially turns into this Joker character. Not the Persona Joker. I'm talking about Batman Joker. You get it. But we also get his background of like him being this illegitimate son of Shido, and him trying to prove himself to Shido, only for Shido to send a shadow version of Akechi to go and kill the real Akechi. And I found all of this really, really great. Such a tragic end for the character, but also he does get a redemption arc right at the end, where he does help the Phantom Thieves escape, do eventually get the final boss battle with Shido, and it's so ridiculous and over the top. But once you defeat him, you would think, you know what, this is the end of the game. I mean, like, they wrapped up all the storylines within the game. Shido was like the linchpin to everything. He's gone. What's left? But this is where we're forced to deal with mementos, and you only have a day to do it. So you're forced to get to the bottom of mementos if you didn't do it initially, and then you also have to complete the depths of mementos, which is essentially another palace. And we learn about Morgana's background, which is really great, and this does really feel like a satisfying final arc to the story here, where mementos is the palace of the public. And for that to be the way the game ends does feel right, especially because the Phantom Thieves spend so much time trying to manage their public image. And obviously with the public as the palace owners, that makes this on such a grander scale than any of the previous palaces that revolved around just one single person. But this does eventually lead to the Holy Grail boss battle, which you can't win, and we end up seeing everyone die one by one, which is obviously depressing, but it's obviously still not the end. We end up in the Velvet Room, where it turns out that the Igor that we've been talking to this entire time wasn't the real Igor. Turns out he's actually the main antagonist of the entire game. He's Yaldabaoth. I can't pronounce that. Whether he's the Holy Grail. We're just going to call him the Holy Grail from this point. But this leads to one-on-one conversations with each of the Phantom Thieves, and those are really strong character moments for each of these characters. And we regroup with the Phantom Thieves to take down the Holy Grail. And I did like how they also explained the Joker and Akechi connection here, with them being picked by the Holy Grail to give them abilities to determine whether or not the world should be preserved or destroyed. And we do get a series of mini boss battles before taking on the Holy Grail itself. And this is a really great boss battle. I really love how this boss battle is designed, where we have to attack each of his limbs, with each one being able to reflect certain attacks and also having certain weaknesses. So this was a really fun final test of all the abilities within the game. But then we get to the end of the battle, where we get the public on our side, and their energy unlocks the ultimate persona that is able to take the Holy Grail down. Again, this was such an anime moment for the game here. Again, really satisfying conclusion for the narrative, but still felt very reminiscent of something you would see from like a Dragon Ball or a Digimon or something to that nature. But again, like to end the game on this scale with the entire public helping us take down this god, again, it's ridiculous, but it does feel like a satisfying way to end this massive epic story that Persona 5 tries to tell here. But that's really most of the game. I mean, the game from this point out is pretty much just scripted. I mean, we have Joker turning himself in order for Shido to be prosecuted for some reason. Then Joker spends a lot of time with his love interests, and he gets a final day where he gets to say goodbye to everybody before we get the final cutscene where the Phantom Thieves drive Joker back home. And again, this is such a satisfying conclusion to the game. I mean, to me, it really just made me feel empty inside when the credits rolled. I mean, this is such a massive game with a narrative on such a grand scale, and with this also having elements of a coming of age story that really hammers home with like everyone going their separate ways. But it reminds me so much of the ending of Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, which is a series that I always held dear, largely due to the characters and how connected I was to them, and to see them going on their own paths at the end of that series. It's a similar type of ending here for Persona that leaves you with a really bittersweet feeling when you end your experience with the game. That is, unless you're playing the Royal version of the game, which we might as well talk about here, as I mean, that's pretty much it for the base version. So I overall have pretty mixed opinions on the Royal version. I mean, I think the first 2/3 of the game are actually pretty harmed by the additions that the Royal version includes, especially narratively. I'm really primarily narratively, where I feel like every single story element they added for that first 2/3 just harmed the pacing of the narrative, with the inclusion of Kasumi and Maruki, who felt really forced in there. And also, I just found Maruki to be a really boring confidant. Obviously, I ended up doing it so that I can get the third semester, but he really just wasn't that interesting of a character, at least right off the bat. The version also adds in an Akechi confidant storyline as well, which I also found kind of boring, at least up until the very, very end. I think the final part of his storyline is a really great scene, but outside of that, again, I didn't really love the story additions up until that point. The gameplay additions were really great. I mean, the gameplay additions essentially made the game easier, so I understand why some people didn't like the combat within this version, but I did like the addition of showtimes and technical damage and bonuses for baton passes, and I really felt like this sped up the gameplay of the game, which was a welcome addition considering, again, this game is way too long. Social stats were also easier to increase in this game, as well as the game gives you more opportunities to do so, which also allowed me to max them out relatively early on in the game, and that helped with the level gating that I talked about earlier. But obviously the biggest change here with the Royal version is the inclusion of the third semester, and at first I was expecting to hate it, as again, I didn't like how shoehorned in the new content was early on in the game, and even at the beginning of this arc, I didn't really like it. I didn't like how this third semester essentially was a distorted reality where everyone's wishes came true and the Phantom Thieves were never a thing, and that just seems so blah to me. Again, like I was expecting another full arc with these characters, But to like find out that, oh, they're just in an alternate reality sort of thing, like that was kind of underwhelming, though they do rectify that. I mean, once Akechi becomes involved, where he's the only other person to realize the reality of the situation, I think this arc really starts to get interesting. We get to spend more time with this crazy version of Akechi that we got very little of in the main game, and the dynamic between him and Joker is really fun here. I actually did like how Maruki was connected, with him having done cognitive research, and through this he was able to use his persona to create this reality, and I actually really like how they handled this. While I do think it's ridiculous that we are going from taking down a god to taking down Maruki, I mean, that is obviously kind of underwhelming, I do think the game does a pretty good job at connecting Maruki to the events of the original ending. Again, the appearance of Akechi is also fantastic, and I did love the revelation that he's actually dead, but his appearance within this storyline is the result of Maruki's reality here. And I did like how they connected Kasumi to this as well, with her actually being Sumire, the real Kasumi's sister, after she had died in an accident before the events of the game. And while I do think it's a bit convoluted with the plot points revolving around this, with the Phantom Thieves thinking she's Kasumi while everyone else knew that she was Sumire, and like, it's like all that's like really convoluted, but I did like the general concept of the storyline, and I did like how Maruki was portrayed as a more reasonable villain, I mean, who had justified motivations, and that made this conclusion to this arc a lot more satisfying, though something I still find unnecessary. I mean, I think both final arcs work. However, I do think the original one was more fitting to that grand story, while this one definitely feels like more of an afterthought. This definitely feels like kind of like a reunion film instead of like part of the actual main narrative of the game, but it doesn't mean it's bad. Though I will say I don't love how they changed the ending itself, like literally the final cutscene, where instead of having this satisfying final scene of Joker and the Phantom Thieves driving to his hometown, instead here we get the ending of Joker going home on a train by himself, with him having interactions with Maruki and Sumire on the way there, and we get this Akechi appearance in the post-credit scene, which is cool, but pretty irrelevant. I mean, I don't like these final scenes nearly as much as the final scene of the main game, especially because, like, still, the focus of the game, despite this final arc, is still the relationship between Joker and the Phantom Thieves. That is the main connection in the game. However, this ending kind of makes it feel like the connections to Maruki and Sumire and Akechi were more important, when really they just weren't. So again, as a whole, I don't mind the Royal version here. I do consider most of the additions here pretty unnecessary. And I do think if I were to replay the game again, I would probably just go for the standard ending, as I do feel like that is a more satisfying overall narrative than this more bloated version of the story, though this more bloated version still isn't entirely bad. But there we go. I mean, those are my opinions on Persona 5. 5 years after its initial release, I still obviously adore this game and find it to still be one of the greatest games of all time, easily the best JRPG of all time for me personally. I mean, it has one of the greatest and grandest narratives in the history of gaming, and in a way, it feels really nostalgic to me. I mean, even though I had only played it for the first time a few years ago, I do have a lot of nostalgia for the narrative of the game, the style of the game, the music of the game. The fact that it essentially reminds me, again, of a shonen anime, which is something that I was really into when I was a kid. Again, like, this game really connected to me in a way that really caught me off guard, because I wasn't expecting it when I first played the game that I was going to love it nearly as much as I did. And Persona 5 is a near perfect game in my eyes. I mean, it's one of the few games I would actually consider a 10 out of 10 game. I think it does everything it tries to do extremely well, which is something you can't really say for the majority of the games that are out there. Even like a game like The Witcher 3, which I've said at points is my favorite game of all time. I think The Witcher 3 is easily a more flawed game than Persona 5. I think Persona 5 is near perfection. Again, the biggest problem, though, is the fact that it is so long. I mean, the fact that it is a 100-hour commitment to play it makes it a game that I'm probably just not going to play nearly as often as I am going to play some of these other games that I also hold very dear. But at the end of the day, though, Persona 5 still remains as one of my favorite games of all time. Though obviously just not one I'm going to play that much. But that's pretty much all I have to say. I mean, that's it for Persona 5. Don't really have much else to plug here. Stay tuned for more game reviews, retrospectives down the road. I mean, this was a pretty major one I wanted to check off my to-do list, and really happy we were finally able to do it here for the 5-year anniversary. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.